Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm your host, Spratt of Sports Info Solutions, joined as always by Schatz of Football Outsiders. It's been a couple of weeks since we've been together. Took some time off for the holidays, but it's a really exciting time now. The regular season's over, the playoffs are starting, it's the new year. Before we get into all of our topics, though, I want to remind everyone that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. Their slogan is Accuracy Matters, and it shows since they've won the Daily Fantasy Accuracy Competition for the past 3 seasons. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, head on over to FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. Aaron, I think the general format of today's show and probably the rest of the playoffs is us going down through each game one at a time. But before we do that today, there was sort of a broader question I had about the wild card weekend that I wanted to ask you. 3 of the 4 wildcard teams are road favorites this week. That seemed pretty unusual just based on my memory, and I wanted to ask you if that's true, is that unusual, and does DVOA sort of support the idea that these road wildcard teams may be some of the best in recent memory?
Yeah, I don't remember for sure. I don't have haven't had a chance to go back through like a database of lines to see if there was another weekend where 3 teams were favorites on the road this week on Wild Card Weekend. But I don't remember another year like this, and it is a really kind of an interesting mix because of the fact there were so many kind of weird circumstances of this year, how the schedules worked out, the fact that 2 divisions were so weak compared to the rest of the league. We've had years where 1 division was so weak compared to the rest of the league, but I don't remember another year where 2 divisions were this weak compared to the rest of the league without at least, 1 really good team involved. The fact that wild card teams are the teams that got hot at the end, whereas that some of the teams that were hot early faded near the end of the year. Although those are not necessarily the teams in the same divisions as the wild cards, right? Because like New England, for example, faded near the end of the year. But you just get this really strange mix of teams where, the other thing was the no extremes. For most of this year, there was no team that was extremely historically great or terrible based on our DVOA ratings, except for Denver on defense and New Orleans on defense being, the worst defense we've ever measured. But other than that, no offense, no special teams, no total. Then at the end, Seattle pulled ahead with that huge Week 17 win over Arizona, so that they end up now among our best teams ever, basically because of that win. Before that, they were, down nowhere a top. It was sort of surprising to have a wild card team number 1, but not too surprising, and they were down where number 1 teams usually are. It was only that last win that put them in historic, the historic place.
Right. But of course, Seattle is the number 1 DVOA team, but the Chiefs and the Steelers are also in the top 5 in DVOA, and all 3 are in the top 5 in weighted DVOA. So these 3 road teams are probably reasonably favored, given that they've been the better teams by DVOA in some of the advanced numbers this year. So I think that's pretty interesting.
Actually, I'll mention Pittsburgh is actually fell to 7th in the last couple of weeks of the year.
Yeah, I misread that.
Because of the Baltimore loss in total. But they are in the top 5 and weighted. And the teams are so packed together that being 7th is not a huge drop. The difference between Carolina at 4, heck, the difference between Cincinnati at 2 and Pittsburgh at 7 is not that big. The teams are very tightly together. And then when you consider that the teams that are slightly better tend to be on the road, it just leads to a playoffs that looks very up in the air.
For sure. And we're going to circle back to all of these teams, but for our team by team, let's go in the same order that they're going to be televised. So let's jump over to the Chiefs at the Texans for our first preview. The thing that most interests me about the Chiefs is really their rushing attack. And you mentioned this in your DVOA article from this week, that the Chiefs finished number 1 in rushing offensive DVOA, and that's despite losing Jamal Charles after the first month of the season. So based on your numbers, were both Charkandrick West and Spencer Ware like really effective running backs?
Well, actually, a lot of it comes from the fact that we still include quarterback running in our rushing split when we split out passing versus running. And it's something I've always wanted to do at some point, is try to split off scrambles and make those count as pass plays in some way, although that can be hard to do when you get back into the historical stuff, because they didn't mark when a run was a scramble until something like 2005 or 2006. But Alex Smith had some really good running games, and he had like 509 rushing yards this year before you start taking the kneel downs out of it.
Yeah.
So that was part of Kansas City's running. As far as how good the other running backs were, we actually have Spencer Ware with a much better rushing DVOA than Shirkandrick West. West was a little bit above average, not as good as Jamal Charles has been in the past, whereas Ware was actually as good as Charles has been in the past, but in a very different role. He's very much a bowling ball, power back, short yardage, goal line kind of guy, as opposed to the shifty, fast outside Charles.
Yeah. And, West may not be the same sort of bowling ball that Ware is, but he broke a tackle every 5 rushing attempts this year, which is actually 6th best of the 30 running backs with 150 carries this year.
Yeah, so you end up with guys who are a different style than Charles, but they really made it work, in part by drawing attention with, Smith bootlegging and whatever, in part by having good offensive line blocking. Everything has, worked well for them in the running game, and that's made them number 1 in running. And so they're number 1 in run offense, and I believe 14th in pass offense, but it combines to be 6th because their run pass ratio is stronger than most of the teams in the league.
Yeah, and I mean, really, they're pretty much the hottest team in football right now, except for maybe the Seahawks. And because they're playing the Texans, who were the lowest rated DVOA team of everyone that made the playoffs, this seems like the biggest mismatch on paper, ignoring the fact, I guess, that the Texans are the home team by virtue of winning their poor division. But I was curious if there might be something specific with the matchup involved that might make you think that the Texans have a chance.
Well, it's the NFL, and everybody always has a chance, but I think that it's tough because the Houston is a better pass defense than they are a run defense as far as ranking. I mean, most teams, people know DVOA, they know that most teams, their pass defense will rank worse than their run defense. Will not rank worse, will have a worse rating because passing tends to be more efficient than rushing. So most pass offenses end up more efficient than run offenses, even if the ranking is different. But I will say that Houston ranks better against the pass, 7th, than they do against the rush, 13th. And the Kansas City's defense ranks better against the pass, 5th, than they do against the rush, which is 11th. And that's important because the Houston run offense is not very good. It was 26th this year. I know you don't think of Houston as a great passing game because the quarterbacks are iffy, but DeAndre Hopkins is as not iffy as you can get.
For sure.
And their running backs, Alfred Blue, Chris Polk, Jonathan Grimes running Wildcats, snore. Nobody really wants any of that. So it's just, I'm sure that Hopkins is going to get his. I have a hard time seeing where Houston is likely to get offense otherwise.
Yeah, that Texans defensive split definitely matches my expectations. J.J. Watt being the obvious reason, but overall, the Texans generated 216 sacks, hits, pressures, and hurries this season. That was the 3rd most in football. So, if the Chiefs can establish an early read and run the ball, then they'll probably be in good shape. But the Chiefs did allow 172 sacks, hits, pressures, and hurries this year. That's many more than the Steelers and Bengals, who were 2nd and 3rd in that stat. They were 13th. So, of all the opponents they could have gotten in the AFC, the Texans may have drawn the best one for them specifically in the Chiefs, but it still seems like the Chiefs should be the clear favorite, which they are.
Right. I mean, they played a team that allows a lot of pressures and sacks a few weeks ago in the Patriots and did nothing against them. So,
true, very true.
I mean, I will say this about I wrote, talked about Watt, but I want to bring attention to Whitney Merciless, who had a really great year. I wrote about him in an ESPN Insider piece I did about, players to watch in the playoffs. He had 12 sacks, was something like 6th in the league, had 23 defeats, which was tied for 10th among edge rushers. And then the guy I wrote about Kansas City in that piece was Ron Parker, the strong safety, and I wrote about how he helped them shut down tight ends. However, I will point out that is not really a very useful thing to do against Houston, which almost never uses its tight end. Woo!
Right, yeah.
Garrett Grant, Ryan Griffin now, actually. Ryan Griffin. He's not Robert Griffin, and he's not the third. He's Ryan Griffin. He's not a dog from Providence. He's Ryan Griffin.
I think that's the definitive way to end that talk. So why don't we move on over to the Steelers at the Bengals? In a lot of ways, this is the most compelling game. This is the Saturday night game, so it's getting the sort of featured slot of the weekend. But to me, it's less interesting from an analytics perspective, I think, just because we've seen these two teams play before so much. But I think the thing that majorly stands out is obviously the fact that A.J. McCarron is going to be presumably starting this weekend instead of Andy Dalton. They've lost. The Bengals have lost 2 of their last 4 games this season with McCarron under center. How big of a step down is it going from Dalton to McCarron based on what we've seen from McCarron in his limited work this year?
It's a step down. I don't think it's as much as a step down as it may have seemed the first week, because you do have to remember that backup quarterbacks will play better when they have a week to prepare as the starter than they will when they have to straight come off the bench.
Yeah.
But Dalton was having by far his best season this year. He was second in DVOA for the season, 32% better than average. McCarron was 7% better than average. And if he had 200 passes is now what we make the minimum to be ranked. If he had 200 passes, he would be 13th among quarterbacks, which I think is better than anybody would expect, but it's 13th in sort of a pile of slightly above average quarterbacks. So there's no question it's a step down. That being said, both Dalton and McCarron, and to say this about Dalton sounds crazy given what we know about his strengths and weaknesses as a player, but both of them excelled at deep passes, which is a real weakness of the Steelers' defense. And that's sort of the picture of how the Bengals can win this game, is by going deep a lot, which McCarron was able to do in that first matchup. He went deep to A.J. Green with a 66-yard touchdown in that game and a big pass interference penalty. And, they didn't lose. Cincinnati didn't lose that game as much because McCarron played awful when he came in. They lost it more because their defense did not play as well as they've generally played for most of the year. Even after you adjust for the quality of the Pittsburgh offense. So I think McCarron is better than I would have expected him to be, especially the deep pass, because the deep pass is something that's more about you, the quarterback, and less about the players around you. I mean, the guy has to get open deep and catch it, and your guys have to block for you long enough to stay upright, but you've got to have the arm and the accuracy to get that thing downfield.
For sure.
And I know, we all thought McCarron was going to come in and just be helped by the players around him. And that's what we thought about Dalton, too. And that seems to be the story of the Bengals, is they've got a lot of talent all around. But these quarterbacks have hit the deep throws, and you've got to have the arm and the accuracy to hit them.
The thing that I found really interesting about McCarron's numbers so far this year, he's thrown for 7.2 yards per attempt, which is exactly what Dalton threw for between 2013 and 2014. So it's possible that they have the new Andy Dalton and A.J. McCarron. This year, Dalton was actually up at 8.4, though, obviously having that huge breakout, second behind only Carson Palmer. And like you mentioned, second in passing DVOA. Okay, I think that's it for that game. So why don't we move on over to the Seahawks at Vikings? We touched about this earlier, about how good the Seahawks have been. Russell Wilson has been maybe the biggest part of their incredible second-half success. I was curious where he ranked in DYAR for the season, and if he is in the mix for you for if you were deciding who the MVP was this season.
Yeah, I will say that, first of all, for those who may not be regular listeners, DVOA is our per play stat. DYAR is for individual players, is a total stat. And so we had Wilson third among quarterbacks in DYAR, behind Palmer and Brady. But Brady is up there because he threw the ball so much. Per play, he's not that high for the year because he faded in the second half, again because of the players around him all getting injured. And this year demonstrated so strongly the difficulty of football stats compared to baseball stats, because your stats are influenced so much by your teammates. And because the debate for MVP comes down in a large part to a player with better stats and better teammates in Carson Palmer, or a player with lesser stats but lesser teammates in Cam Newton. I know his conventional stats, the touchdown interception ratio, like that was great, but the fact is that for DVOA, I think he was like 8th or 9th in the year in passing, and even when you add in his rushing value, it doesn't make things better. So, I mean, it makes things better, but not
doesn't bridge the gap fully.
Not where Carson Palmer was.
Sure.
Carson Palmer was insane this year. So when I voted in, I was a Brady guy for most of the year, and then I switched to favoring Palmer when Brady faded, and then at the end of the year, I switched to Wilson. And when I voted in Peter King's MMQB Awards, I voted for Wilson as my number one for MVP. And the reason why is that I think it's sort of like he did everything that Newton did and Palmer did combined, except his defense gave up all the leads. Right? Like,
no, they did.
Do we really want to fault Russell Wilson for the fact that the defense kept giving up fourth quarter leads? He built those leads. And then he got better in the second half of the season, right? He was insane. His, quote-unquote best receiver, even though they didn't really use him that well, goes out halfway through the season in Jimmy Graham, and all of a sudden he's insane. Weeks 1 through 9, Russell Wilson's passing DVOA, 4% below average. Weeks 10 through 17, 54% above average. So he's third for the year. He's got more stat value than Cam Newton, with all of the arguments that Cam Newton has about the players around him, right? Cam Newton had a weak offensive line. Russell Wilson has a weak offensive line, and his best offensive lineman got injured halfway through the year. Cam Newton doesn't have a lot of good receivers to throw to. Russell Wilson doesn't have a lot of good receivers to throw through to. Doug Baldwin is underrated, but in a perfect offense, he really should be a 2, not a 1. Tyler Lockett is impressive, but he is a rookie, let's be honest here.
Yeah.
Jermaine Kearse is a guy who, in any other, he'd be J.J. Nelson for crying out loud in another offense, only, not 12 pounds or whatever J.J. Nelson weighs. The tight end went out halfway through the year. I mean, he's got a good running game, but so does Carolina has a good running game. So it's like every negative about that Newton had to deal with, Wilson had to deal with, except that Wilson's running backs were a little bit better, and his number one receiver is a little bit better. And his numbers came close to what Palmer did. So that's why I went with Wilson as my MVP choice. I thought it kind of split the thing. And the other thing I will say about this MVP choice is, when I said part of the year that I thought Brady or I thought Palmer, I got people insinuating on the Twitter that that's a racial thing. And I realized that there's been a racial thing about Cam Newton through his career. And I've always hated that and spoken out against the idea that he was lazy or not a hard worker. That's all such was racist nonsense. That Nolan Narwicki scouting report that came out before he came out of college is such nonsense. But I don't think it's awful to say that the guy was the second or third best player in the league this season. Like people were talking to me on Twitter, like for me to say that I think Carson Palmer was slightly better than Cam Newton this year is racist. And it's not to say the guy is like a top 3 player. It doesn't seem like you're saying he's lazy. It seems like you're just saying Carson Palmer was amazing this year, which he was. And I think Russell Wilson was too. And Tom Brady was too, although more slanted towards the first half of the season, whereas Wilson was slanted towards the second half of the season, and Newton and Palmer were doing it pretty evenly throughout the entire season. But I hate the fact that a discussion of MVP this year has to get wrapped up in all the nonsense garbage that some people have been writing about Cam Newton for 5 years, which is nonsense garbage even if Carson Palmer and Russell Wilson were just a little bit better than him this year.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, even if you're not advocating my boy Cam Newton.
Also, I like his dancing. I'm all in favor of his dancing. I like celebration. People ask me, right, if you were commissioner of the National Football League for a day, what's the first change you would make? And they expect me to say something statistical or say something about some complicated rule. No. The first thing I would do is get rid of all celebration penalties and let these guys go out there and enjoy themselves. So when people started whining about Cam Newton dancing too long earlier this year, I just wanted to bang my head against a wall. It was so stupid.
Okay. I'm going to try to jump us back on track a little bit here. You You mentioned about how great Wilson has been in the second half. From the start of his interception-less streak in Week 11, he threw for 8.8 yards per attempt, and that was the second most in football. Do you know who the first was over that period with 9.0 yards per attempt?
I'm shuddering to think what you're going to say, but I think I know.
It's Kirk Cousins.
Kirk Cousins.
And we're going to circle back to that in a moment. But let's continue with a little bit more Seahawks versus Vikings.
Yeah, actually, let me.
Go ahead.
The Seahawks I meant to mention earlier, but I want to get talking about the year as a whole, because the Seahawks being a wild card team and being number one is sort of interesting. Like, how often does that happen?
Oh yeah.
And it turns out it does happen more than you think, but rarely is a wild card team like a historically great team. But what's funny is that the last wild card team to be among our historically great teams was also the Seahawks. Like, the thing about the 2015 Seahawks is they're incredibly similar to the 2012 Seahawks, who went 11-5, who were also a tremendously well-rounded team that also ranked in the top 4 in offense, defense, and special teams, that also got better as the year went along. Like, the 2012 team is something like the 7th best team we'd ever measured, and the 2015 team is like the 8th best team we've ever measured. So apparently, like, you have to win your division to be among the best teams in DVOA history, unless you're the Seahawks. There's only 3 other teams that finished above 30% DVOA and didn't win their division. The 2008 Eagles, who were 9-6-1. The 2004 Bills, who missed the playoffs entirely, and that team is worth its own freaking podcast. And the 92 Eagles, who were 11-5, but finished behind the Dallas Cowboys when the Cowboys were winning Super Bowls. But those teams were nowhere near as good as the 2012 to 2015 Seahawks, which are just like the best wildcard teams of the last 25 years. So go Seahawks, lose to Arizona and San Francisco.
Well, I mean, so maybe their one-loss record doesn't actually suggest this, but based on DVOA, they're on an incredible 4-year run in DVOA, being at the top of the leaderboard.
Every year for 4 years. It's kind of insane, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And the other thing about this year that's interesting is people often, when I talk about our ratings having certain teams high and low, they're like, well, what do you think this is like, the NCAA tournament? You want to just like seed the teams based on some math formula? And no, I don't really want to seed the teams based on a math formula. And why are you talking like that with that voice? But I do believe wins and losses should seed the teams, right? The goal is to win. The goal is not to have a better DVOA. DVOA is good for talking about teams and predicting the future, but that isn't the goal. The goal is to win the games. But I will say this year that DVOA would have picked the exact same 12 teams for the playoffs. I don't remember another year where that happened. I haven't checked for sure. But every team that every team that made the playoffs had higher DVOA than the teams they beat to get into the playoffs. Right? The Jets were the highest team in DVOA that didn't make the playoffs, but they were behind the number 1 team in their own division and 2 other teams that finished in second place. So they would have missed the playoffs. Houston had the highest DVOA in its division, and Washington had the highest in its division. So essentially we got the playoffs we should have had if you pick things by math.
Nice. Let's talk about Minnesota, because they're actually playing in this game, so we should at least mention them.
I know, it's hard to imagine they are. When we did the Outsiders Staff Fantasy League, like, no one from Minnesota got picked. Are they in this game? Like, they're in this game, and they've won a bunch of games in the second half of the season, and they'll have a lot of great players. Adrian Peterson, come on, man. I mean, but it feels like they're not in this game because Seattle is so hot.
And so watch them win. But anyway, so the Vikings, they're 16th overall in offensive DVOA. They have Adrian Peterson. So I'm assuming that their running offense is a little bit better than their passing offense. Is that the case?
Yes, but again, based on ranking. Now, because of passing always being more efficient than running for almost every team, that Minnesota actually is, comes out better in passing than rushing when you look at all plays. They're 7% over average passing and exactly average rushing, 0%. But that's when you compare to all plays.
Right.
If you rank based on just runs and just passes, they are 8th in rushing and 19th in passing, which I think matches what we feel about the Vikings. You would think they'd be higher, But the fact is, early in the season, Peterson had a very bad success rate. People were talking about how he was back, but he actually was getting stuffed at the line a ton and then breaking a few long runs. And that's not all about the offensive line, because while the Minnesota offensive line is horrible at pass blocking, it's pretty good at run blocking. That's kind of like why Matt Khalil still has a job. So, but his rushing got better over the course of the year and more consistent.
Now, I mean, the thing that I sort of picture about the Seahawks defense is the Legion of Boom and the excellent pass rushing from, Bennett and Averill and those guys. How do they fare against a rush-heavier team like this? Could this potentially be an okay matchup for the Vikings?
Well, the problem is that the Seattle defense is also great against the run.
That's kind of what I figured, actually.
They're third against the run this year, trailing only the Jets and Arizona. And Bennett is great against the run. And, there's I'm blanking on their defensive tackles right now. Jordan Hill, but he just came back from injury. Atiyah Rubin, who used to be pushed back a lot in Cleveland, but I guess playing with better players around him in Seattle, he's been able to be a bit more stalwart. And, of course, good linebackers. And, of course, Cam Chancellor is always in the freaking box.
For sure, yeah.
Earl Thomas is so good against the pass that it makes them better against the run by allowing them to drop Chancellor down all the time. And I really don't see any reason not to against the Vikings. Unless you're that scared of Stephon Diggs, but I doubt it.
Yeah. Okay, let me try this from the other angle then. The thing that's interesting about the Seahawks closing out the year was that random seeming loss to the Rams. But it might not have been quite as random as you think. In that game, the Rams generated 25 sacks, hits, pressures, and hurries. And they actually led the league this year with 240, while the Seahawks, as we've sort of mentioned a little bit with Wilson's MVP case, they allowed the second most sacks, pressures, etc. at 231, ahead of only the Browns. The Vikings are also a top 10 team in generating sacks, hits, and pressures. So, maybe from a defensive standpoint, they can get to Wilson a little bit here, take advantage of that weak offensive line, and hold their offense a little bit more at bay than many of their other opponents towards the end of the season.
And you have to remember that in that first game where Minnesota got destroyed by Seattle, 3 of their best defensive players were injured. Not pass rushers, but it was Anthony Barr was out, Harrison Smith was out, and I believe Linval Joseph is the third.
Yeah.
And so that hurts their defense overall. Even though Robeson and Griffin played, the defense was really hurt. And I don't think that Seattle's going to beat them by 9,000 points again, like they did a few weeks ago.
Okay, well, good. Maybe that'll be an interesting game then.
I think it's going to be more interesting than people expect. I expect Seattle to win, but I expect it to be closer than people would expect because of the weather, because of Minnesota being healthier, because of Seattle. It is a thing that when Pacific Coast teams play at 1 o'clock Eastern, that overall they do play a little bit worse. That is actually a thing, even though it didn't happen last time these two teams played. And so I think when you put that all together, I don't think Seattle's going to blow them out, but they are the better team.
Okay. One more game to go, but before we get there, let me mention again that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. They believe that accuracy matters, and it shows since they've won the daily fantasy accuracy competition for the past 3 years. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, head over to FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. Okay, Aaron, the last game of the week is Packers at Redskins. It's the closest game by spread, and given how much worse the Packers have been than expectations and how much better the Redskins have been than expectations, that seems like it fits. I teased a little bit earlier with that crazy Kirk Cousins stat over the second half, but by traditional statistics over the course of the full season, he's actually been comparable, if not a little bit better than Aaron Rodgers. Cousins has a 69.8% completion percentage. Rodgers is only 60.7%. Cousins threw for more yards, 29 versus 11 touchdowns and interceptions, similar to Rodgers' 31-8. Cousins threw for 7.7 yards per attempt. Rodgers only threw for 6.7. A lot of those numbers point to that Cousins had a breakout season and was actually better than Rodgers. Does DYAR, I can't talk, does that agree with those traditional statistics?
Yes, but I will also point out 2 other things. One is a set of numbers. Green Bay ranked 5th in toughest schedule on offense. Washington ranked 28th. So part of what's going on here, in particular in the second half of the season, is that Cousins played a fairly easy schedule, and that did juice his statistics a little bit. I talked about Russell Wilson's DVOA split, and Cousins, even though Cousins had a better yards per attempt than Wilson in the second half of the season, he didn't have as good a DVOA, but the split is still pretty heavy. Weeks 1 to 9, Cousins was 1% better than average passing. Weeks 10 to 17, 38% better than average. But in both of those splits, he takes a hit from schedule strength because of Washington's schedule.
Right.
But Aaron Rodgers, in the first part of the season, 25% better than average. In the second part, 20% worse than average. And the tough schedule was front-loaded, okay? So Rodgers played an average schedule of defenses in the second half of the season. Most of the hard defenses Green Bay played were the first half of the season, ending with that game against Denver, which, of course, was the best defense in the league. So for the whole year, we have Cousins 6th in DVOA, 7th in DYAR. Rodgers is 17th in both. The other point I'm going to make, though, is what we said about the MVP race, which is your teammates. Teammates matter, and Green Bay has the loss of Jordy Nelson, turned out to be a much bigger deal than anybody expected. Whereas Cousins got his best receiver back in mid-year when Deshaun Jackson came back. And if Cousins is going to be hitting that deep pass, Deshaun Jackson is going to be catching that deep pass. And he had a better tight end, much better than what Green Bay had. He had better receivers at every receiving position except for the slot, where, I'll take Randall Cobb over Jameson Crowder. Thank you. The one thing he didn't have is a running game. Washington was dead last in rushing DVOA.
Yeah. How were the Packers defensively versus the run then, and versus the pass?
Yeah, the Packers' defense was much better against the pass than the run. So they were 6th against the pass and 19th against the run, but they've been declining against the pass in the second half of the year, especially with Sam Shields injured. And I do not believe Shields is going to be able to play in this game, and that's a big loss as far as covering Deshaun Jackson.
For sure. Yeah, these first versus second half splits for both of these teams, they sort of paint the picture very nicely in DVOA. Because Green Bay's full season DVOA is 10th, but their weighted DVOA is 15th. While Washington is 12th in full year, but 19th. Oh, I think I had that backwards. So, yeah, Washington is 15th versus 19th for the Packers. So it's like Washington's weighted DVOA is actually much better than the Packers, and it actually isn't even that far away from Arizona's. So I'm kind of curious if maybe based on their end-of-season play, maybe we should be taking them a little bit more seriously as a contender here, and not just this week, but potentially to win multiple games in the playoffs.
Right. The tough part of this is that historically, total season DVOA does just as good a job of predicting the playoffs as weighted DVOA. And you don't think it should be that way. Common sense suggests it shouldn't be that way. But it is that way. The better sample. It's the bigger sample. So I think what happens is you ask yourself, when does weighted DVOA versus total DVOA, when is it related to injuries, and when is it just related to kind of random variations? Mm-hmm. I think with Green Bay, the decline seems more like random variation. It's not that anyone in particular got injured in the second half of the year. Sam Shields on defense, but not on offense. It was the same guys. It's just, I guess, that everybody went out there and figured out that Jordy Nelson was not on the field. I don't know how they didn't figure that out from the beginning. I knew he wasn't on the field in week 1. I knew he wasn't there. So I don't know how it took other teams a while to figure out that he wasn't there. But with Washington, I think it is a little bit more about injuries. If you think about, in particular, getting Deshaun Jackson back. But on defense, I think they've basically been playing the same defensive guys. And the defense is just not very good for Washington. They're 21st. They're bad against both the run and the pass equally. Not really bad, but a little bit bad. So, when you think about that over the course of the year, Green Bay was a little bit better, but then Washington's the home team, and the difference between the two of them wouldn't be enough to overcome home field advantage. And then when you kick in the fact that Shields is hurt, and you kick in the fact that Washington has been playing better and Green Bay has been playing worse, I think those things tend to favor Washington. but I have a hard time taking them super seriously for the whole playoffs. Another thing I'll say is that they were 26th in variance, so they tend to have really good games, really bad games, which is the kind of thing where Washington could have a big upset, but I have a really hard time imagining they're going to win 3 straight games to make it to the Super Bowl. I do think this game, I think they're rightfully favored, be given, that they're at home, even if you try to balance out full year versus weighted, the fact that Washington's at home should make them the favorite. But when you move to the next, let's say that every favored team wins in this round, right?
Okay.
The Chiefs are going to be a major, that they're really dangerous, I would think, for the Patriots right now, given how well their defense is playing. Whether the Steelers or Bengals win, it doesn't matter. Either of those teams is very dangerous for either the Patriots or Steelers. The Seahawks are obviously playing awesome.
I'm terrified, obviously.
Okay? I feel like whoever wins the Packers-Redskins game moves on, and then Carolina or Arizona yawns.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I'm compelled by this game, certainly. I kind of want to see a little bit more to see if I can buy in more to Cousins. But this game and all the games this weekend are pretty interesting, so I'm definitely looking forward to watching them. I think that pretty much wraps up everything we wanted to cover today, Aaron. But I look forward to talking to you again next week when we've got 4 more playoff games that should be pretty interesting. In the meantime, enjoy your weekend, and I hope everybody listening to the show would subscribe to it on iTunes, and we will catch you next week.